I'm going to introduce myself. So my name is Alex Kurgan. I'm the principal learning experience designer at Hone. I have over 15 years of experience in educational technology. My background is in philosophy. I was really interested in philosophy of mind. And then I started to apply that to more practical things like behavioral science and learning. Originally, I'm from Belarus, but can anyone tell from the picture on the left where I am today? Any guesses? Yep, you're all thinking it. It is New Jersey. Beautiful New Jersey. It's known as the Garden State. New Jersey is actually, when you look at like a head-to-head among states, it's like, would you rather live in New Jersey or Montana? New Jersey is like one of the last states it always loses, but it's actually a pretty darn good state. So it's cool that people have the wrong idea about it. But anyway, that brings us to the topic of the day, which a lot of people also have the wrong idea about, which is honing how to actually hone your team skills and what kinds of practice really work. To get us into this topic, let's do something kind of mysterious. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. Did anyone experience an aha moment by a show of hands where you suddenly understood something that was really weird or confusing beforehand? Yeah, at least a few of you, right? So that feeling of aha, now I get it. What are you talking about? Oh, okay, now I understand. There's actually something that happens in the brain. There's a little burst of activity when you finally realize something, when something clicks. It happens in something called the superior temporal gyrus. You could maybe, if you're really in tune with your brain, actually feel it happening in your brain when something clicks for you. In other words, it feels really good to learn something, even if what you're learning was very small. And in fact, you're now more likely to remember that sentence, the haystack was important because the cloth ripped, because you had that initial confusion about it. And then all of a sudden you had a realization about what it meant. So this is to say that when we learn things, we feel joy. As the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, joy is the feeling of one's power increasing. It feels really good to get better at things. Learning allows us to have that feeling as part of our daily lives. It allows us, those of you who are in the learning profession, allows us to create that feeling in other people's lives, which is amazing, right? It's really a noble thing. So it's really important for us to have an accurate handle of it. And it's important for the learners on our teams to also have an accurate handle of learning. So with that in mind, let's do a little audit of our intuitions about learning. Which of these statements is true? A, and you can answer in the chat. A, your learning style is important to consider when you learn. B, repetition is a reliable way to learn. C, people are good judges of which learning strategies work. And it could be more than one. So let's see what people think. Answer in the chat. A, B, C, or some combination. Got some A's coming in. Some people think it's all three, A and B. A. Take a stab here. A, B. Matt says not C. Okay, all of the above. So this is actually a trick question. I said it could be more than one, but it wasn't. It's actually none of these. None of these are true. And we're going to explore why that is in a moment. But one thing I'll say about A, which a lot of you chose, the idea that people have different ingrained learning styles is very, very common. There was a study of 3,000 people and showed that 90% of those 3,000 people believe that idea. But there's actually no evidence that learning styles help you learn. Research suggests that we have different learning preferences maybe, but people are not really one kind of learner or another. And so you're better off choosing the instruction style that makes most sense for the content that you're trying to learn. So if you're trying to learn how to play classical music, you're going to listen to it. And that's going to be the best modality for you, even if you consider yourself a reader. You might need to read some, but the modality is determined by the content itself or the subject matter. And if you still strongly believe in learning styles, I believe there's a prize of like $10,000 or $100,000 if you can actually prove that learning styles are real. I think it's out there that you would get quite a hefty sum. Now let's see how true B is. The idea that repetition is a reliable way to learn. Seems pretty normal, common sense to say, right? Well, if that was the case, we would be able to tell which is the real penny, right? And I think most folks here are from the US. I think there's someone from Germany here, so you're off the hook. But just take a look at these and answer in the chat. Which is the real penny? So Rocky says B, although I don't know if that was B for the previous question. Which is the real penny? Tim says I or L. I'll give you the benefit of that. Could be what if it's one of those, you'll get it. J. Rocky says no clue. Yeah, a lot of people say no clue, and even if you, Jane is now suspicious of everything, so she says none. I'm not tricking you here. The answer is on here, and it's actually A. And even if you got the answer right, which I believe none of you did, you're probably not 100% sure of it, which is to say you may have seen a penny a million times in your life, but that repeated exposure is not a guarantee that you've learned anything, or specifically learned what it looks like exactly. We usually learn only what we have to get by. So as long as you can recognize a penny in a mix of other coins, you never have to encode any other details about it. So repetition on its own is not a reliable way to learn. So we have these two ideas. Learning styles are really important. If I just repeat, I'm going to learn something. These are two very common ideas that we have. And they're related to this third idea that our intuitions about learning are often spectacularly wrong. So for example, the two most popular learning strategies in school are cramming and going over highlighted notes. So you're reading text, you're highlighting it, then you're going back over the highlights. These are two of the least effective approaches to learning because they create false confidence. And so one of the other strongest and wrongest intuitions that we have about learning, and the one that might actually be holding back you the most or the people on your team the most, is that we're good at certain things and bad at certain other things. There's not really much we can do to change that. And one form of this idea is our strong belief that the world's top geniuses were born with some kind of innate talent for their field. So take, for instance, someone who is considered to be one of the greatest geniuses in the history of the world, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And at 7 years old, Mozart could hear any note on any instrument, and he could immediately identify exactly which note it was. And it actually wasn't even instruments only. He could hear the chime of a clock or even the sound of somebody sneezing. And so he'd hear someone say, achoo, and would be able to say, that's a B flat. And at the time, this ability, it seemed like a miracle for a 7-year-old to have this skill, right? But if we take a look at his background, a closer look, we get a pretty good idea of what actually happened. So his father was a really talented violinist and composer in his own right. And his father, Leopold Mozart, actually wrote the first ever training book for children's musical development. Mozart had nearly every kind of musical instrument in his house. By the time he was 4, his father was working with him full time, and he also had an older sister who's a very talented musician herself. And so this is really the perfect environment for developing perfect pitch, which was amazing, the kind of perfect pitch that Mozart had, and also his prodigious talents. In fact, there was a study in Japan, I think it was in the early 90s, that looked at 24 children between the ages of 2 and 6, and it showed that all of them were able to develop perfect pitch after a few months of training. For some people, it took 1 month. For some people, it took like 3 months or 4 months, something like that. But all of them were able to develop that. In fact, actually, Mozart was pretty slow to mature as a composer. It takes about 10 years to become an overnight success. There's a lot of research to show this, and it's not just in music, it's really in anything. It's on all the things that you're trying to get people to get good at. Maybe in your role, you're trying to get people to become better coaches. You're trying to be a better coach yourself. It takes a really, really long time to get really good at that. There was a study done by a cognitive psychologist named John Hayes, who looked at the 500 most popular pieces of music that were played by symphonies between 1685 and 1900. And what he found was that almost every piece was written at least 10 years after each composer had begun their career. There were only 3 exceptions out of those 500 pieces, which were written in years 8 and 9. In fact, it took Mozart nearly 20 years before he composed his first masterpiece. So he was kind of slow. And these findings are consistent across anything. Take painting, for instance. So if you look at a lot of Picasso's work, you might assume that he was always just super innovative in how he painted. But he began painting in a totally traditional style. And over time, he explored additional styles until he landed on his own kind of unique thing, right? So this is all to say that anyone who's been labeled a genius or super talent throughout history, or even just within your organizations, is probably someone who's practiced for thousands of hours first. And it's okay if you haven't started doing that when you were 4 years old, right? Unless you're trying to be the very best in the world at something, that doesn't really matter. So what we're going to focus on in the rest of today's session is, how do you take the right steps to continually make that progress over those years in whatever it is that you're trying to improve? And how can you encourage other people to take those same steps and to take them seriously and not kind of fall back to our traditional ideas about how learning works? Like, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner and I'm just going to repeat this thing. And, I'm going to cram sometimes and I'm going to get better. Okay. So with that, we're going to jump into recap. So our intuitions about learning are often wrong, and that's going to be the case with the people that we're trying to train or facilitate to, and so forth as well. Okay. Repetition on its own is not a reliable way to learn. Your learning style is not important to consider when you learn, and genius or expertise is a long process of small developments. It's not an innate gift. And so if you find you're stuck, or you find that you're not good at something that you really want to get good at, it's just an issue of not having gone through that process. One of the things that helps people wrap their minds around what it really takes to learn is to physicalize the process of learning and talk about what's happening in the brain when you're learning. So your brain actually changes quite a lot when you practice. One of the best studies to illustrate this was done in London in 2014. London is a really difficult place to drive in. Has anyone driven in London and knows this to be true? Yeah, Michelle does. So there's no street grid. It's got a lot of major streets that curve. It has 12 different bridges. If you want to get from one place to another in London, you probably have to cross at least one bridge. And if you want to be a cab driver in London, you need to know really everything about this map. In fact, the licensing examination for driving a cab in London has been described as the most difficult test in the world. And in 2014, neuroscientists used MRIs to actually look at the brains of 16 taxi drivers in London and compare them with the brains of 50 other men of similar age who were not taxi drivers. And what they found is that there's a particular part of the hippocampus which is dedicated to spatial navigation, which was actually much larger for those taxi drivers than in other subjects. Furthermore, the more time someone spent being a taxi driver, the larger that part of the brain was. So it was really that kind of practice that was physically changing the appearance of the brain for these people. In other words, practice literally grows certain areas of your brain, like doing curls at the gym might grow your biceps. And people are kind of understand the idea of how adaptable our bodies are. But up until about 20 years ago, the general belief was that once you reach adulthood, your brain is kind of fixed. You can't really rewire it. Many people assume that our brains are like computers, where you load software onto, you can change the software, but you're limited by your hardware. By contrast, we understand that our bodies are highly adaptable. So for example, if you're really fit, you can probably do like 30 or 40 push-ups at a time. If you can do 100 push-ups all in a row, you could probably win a few bets. Given that information, what might you guess is the world record for nonstop push-ups? What do you think? And enter into the chat. Think. Bob says 300, 150, 400, few thousands. We're getting more ambitious here. Michael's got 1,500. Anyone want to try to beat Michael? 1,501. So in 1980, Minoru Yoshida of Japan did 10,507 push-ups nonstop. Someone else recently set a world record. They actually stopped counting nonstop push-ups and they started counting, like Guinness counts how many you can do in 12 hours. And I think like a couple of weeks ago, someone did over 20,000 push-ups in 12 hours. And it's something similarly crazy with pull-ups. Only recently have we come to understand that our brains are endowed with the same kind of extreme adaptability, which you might know of as neuroplasticity. We can make connections between neurons, we can strengthen or weaken connections, we can make new neurons grow. And there are some things like language acquisition or perfect pitch that are better taught to little children. But in general, your brain and body retain a great deal of adaptability throughout adulthood. And even if you're an older adult, you can still develop a wide variety of new capabilities with the right training. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of today's session. What is that right training? What does that look like? What does it look like for you? What does it look like for the people on your team? And sorry, Michael, I tried, but no one stooped so low as to choose 1501. Okay, so honing your skills with deliberate practice. So over the last few decades, scientists have discovered that there are some principles around tapping into that extreme adaptability of our brains and our bodies to learn new things. So we're going to actually do this together for ourselves, and there are going to be ways of applying this to the people on your team as well. But let's have everyone jump into this form. And what you're going to do is we go along, and I'm going to prompt you each time. You can put your email address in here if you want to receive the learning plan in your inbox, if you want to copy. If not, you can just keep this for your notes for now, so you don't have to fill that out. But let's just write in for now. What is something you want to get better at and that you would be really willing to practice? And let's have, if you're comfortable, let's have everyone enter into the chat what that is after you fill that out for yourself. And we're just focusing on number one here. And again, if at least a couple of you can share with the group, maybe inspire some folks, maybe find that you have some things in common with other people. What is that thing that you want to practice more? Could be work related, doesn't have to be. Probably the first thing you think about is not going to be work related, just like where people's minds go. But yeah, either one. Matt's got the first work related one, website building. There you go. Okay, so we have yoga, meditation, painting, swimming, American Sign Language, fiction writing, learning another language, speaking Spanish, software data analysis. Okay, awesome. And even if you haven't submitted in the chat, please do fill out this form, because the questions build on each other to help you understand kind of what it takes for you to get better at something and what it takes for someone else as well. Jennifer mentions programming. Great. Thank you so much. So with that thing in mind of what you're trying to get better at, I'm going to read this quote to you from famous violinist Nathan Milstein. He once wrote, "Once when I became concerned because others around me practiced all day long, I asked Professor Auer, how many hours should I practice? And he said, it really doesn't matter how long. If you practice with your fingers, no amount is enough. If you practice with your head, 2 hours is plenty." This is another way of saying that repetition on its own is not a good way to learn. What matters is what you're repeating and how you're repeating it. So what does it mean to practice with your head or to do deliberate practice? Here's the model that we created for this that kind of helps encapsulate all of the major ideas. It's a flywheel because every cycle helps it spin faster. So the more you know about a given area, right, the more foundations you understand about advanced Excel, the more you can learn additional things about it, right? This is true for anything. So the more of the background you have, the more you develop your skills, the easier it's going to be to develop additional skills. That's why it's a flywheel. And this flywheel starts with focusing on what you want to learn. then stretching or challenging yourself, and finally getting feedback on your performance. So let's look at each of these aspects one at a time and consider, as we're going through this, how are you doing these things for yourself? How are you doing them for other people? So we start with focusing on what you want to change. So imagine you're a tennis player and you want to play doubles tennis, and you're just starting out. So it might take you like 6 months or a year until you're kind of able to play and keep the ball and play with people and have fun with your friends. And some people would refer to that as practice, right? I'm going out there and playing. Yeah, I'm practicing tennis, right? And some people, when they're just doing their job, you think of that as practice, right? My job involves doing Excel and I'm doing it. And so I'm practicing, right? But in truth, you're really just reacting to the situations that you're in, and you're doing your best, but you're not really trying to change what you're doing. Instead, focused practice involves pinpointing something that you want to change. Like in tennis, it might be, I'm going to practice my serve, or I'm going to practice my backhand. Or if I'm trying to get better at coaching, I'm going to practice the way I ask questions or the way I listen. If I'm trying to get better at programming, I might be practicing some very specific kinds of code, right? Or programming specific types of things, right? So focus is really important. And it leads us away to this, what we might call naive practice, where you're just kind of doing stuff and reacting to whatever happens. So with that in mind, let's continue our learning plan in the form. What's one aspect of that skill or behavior that you want to focus on improving? So if you put in programming for this, what do you want to specifically improve when it comes to programming, right? Same thing, speaking Spanish, website building. What is that one thing that you want to focus on? So I'll give you another moment to do this. Could someone volunteer to share an example of one thing that they're trying to focus on in their overall topic area? If no volunteer, I'm gonna choose someone. How about you, Chris?
Mine is, sorry, saying this again, as I did in my breakout room, but very boring, that I just want to work with Excel a little bit more than I do on a daily basis. So kind of focusing more on really using formulas and not just building sheets that look pretty.
Awesome. So using formulas, perfect, right? So that's a good focus area. And then as you start to practice that, you might find that there's additional things that you need to drill down on, right? So it's these kinds of formulas specifically that are more difficult than others, right? Or they are more important to you, right? Awesome. Would anyone else like to share or run by the group of focus area? How about you, Marcia?
Yeah, I'd love feedback, because mine is really doing a better job of like prioritizing tasks, like organizing daily tasks, and then prioritizing and actually completing them. And just tend to be a little bit disorganized.
Yeah, prioritizations is actually kind of a hard one to practice, because it's not exactly like a field of study. Like you can't like study prioritization per se, but with respect to focusing, like even just one of the things you mentioned, like I just want to complete things. I'm going to focus on that initially. There are lots of different things I can focus on. I can focus on setting up a really effective long-term prioritization schedule. I can focus on my daily schedule. I can focus on a weekly schedule, or I can focus on completion. I can focus on making sure I have energy to do things. So there are all these different focus areas, and the key is to choose one for now. You might want to work on all of them, but initially you're choosing one. Okay. So then the second step is, once you've identified that focus area, you have to stretch your skills. And the idea here is that for any skill, you have a comfort zone. And these are things that you can do well without thinking too hard. So if you're trying to speak in Spanish to someone, it might be really easy for you to have a very simple conversation about how someone's day is going. But if it comes to maybe talking about the weather, that might be in your stretch zone, right? Or if you're trying to coach someone, it's really easy for you to listen, but when it comes time to asking incisive questions, that becomes a little more challenging for you. So the stretch zone is things that you can kind of do. or things that you can do with some effort, or things that you can do that take a little bit extra time, or that you might need help with. And then there's a layer outside of that, which is stuff that you can't do. It's stuff that you really hate doing that makes you feel super panicky. So for coaching, it might be like coaching someone who's an executive. You might feel really uncomfortable doing that. And so there's no need to practice that or do that. You want to stick in your stretch zone. I'm going to coach one of my direct reports or someone who's junior to me. I'm going to ask them questions. I'm going to practice that and focus on that. Right. So for whatever it is that you're trying to do, you want to find what's in that stretch zone and not go too far. You want to be at the edge of your ability. So with that in mind, thinking about your focus area, let's enter for 3A, 3B, and 3C. What is something that's totally within your comfort zone when it comes to that focus area? What's something with your stretch zone? You can kind of do it. You need help. It takes extra time, whatever it is. And what's something in your panic zone, right? So again, it's with respect to formulas, right? So when it comes to formulas, it's totally within my comfort zone to do like a sum of a column. It's in my stretch zone to do some more advanced thing. And it's in my panic zone. If someone asked me to do, some kind of regression analysis, I couldn't do it and I would feel really demoralized, right? So that's just one example with one of the things somebody mentioned. Let's take about a minute or so to fill this in for ourselves. Could we get one person who hasn't shared yet? Could we get you to share your responses to this? Tim, do you mind jumping in?
Yeah, I can do that. I'm still figuring that out. So my thing I want to get better at is learning a new language. And so I think I can handle my comfort zone would be something in a very simple conversation. I think I guess my stretch zone would be I guess something beyond that. Maybe a few a few sentences. My panic zone would be trying to have a full conversation in Spanish.
Yeah. And so that tells you what kind of practice you might want to do, right? So like you're not going to sit down with a native speaker and that would be your practice. That's demoralizing. That's panicky, right? That middle ground of speaking a few sentences, that might be something that you do with a coach or a teacher or something like that, right? Who can get at that level, or someone else who's learning it at your level, right? And ideally also when you're filling out 3A, 3B, 3C, or when you're thinking about this, you're thinking about it with respect to that one focus area. So I mean, what you said was great, but if you want to get even more specific, I'm trying to speak this language, but one thing I want to focus on is talking about sports with someone, or talking or just having a basic conversation where I greet someone. That might be your focus area, and then you can define comfort, stretch, and panic zone with respect to that. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So then the third part of the flywheel. So we're focusing on some area, we're stretching, and then we have to get feedback. If you're practicing in your stretch zone, you're going to be making errors. And if you're not, then you're probably not in your stretch zone. That's one indication that you're actually at the level that you need to be at, is when you're practicing, is it hard enough that you're making some errors? And it's really important to get feedback on those errors. That feedback is probably best coming from someone else, like a coach, a mentor, a friend, a colleague. If you're an L&D person and you're administering training to people and you're kind of letting them go on their own, how are they actually getting feedback on what it is that they're doing and when they make errors? So that's one consideration we're going to talk about in a breakout room in a moment. Feedback can also be something that you give yourself. For example, Benjamin Franklin, when he was practicing writing, he would take an article from a newspaper, he would rewrite the whole article in poetry, and then he would rewrite the poetry back into prose and then compare his final prose to the initial article. That's a really weird kind of way of doing things, but it worked for him as a way of giving himself feedback. So that might be something that you have to rely on, but ideally within your organization, there are lots of nodes for feedback that you can tap into so that people aren't relying on themselves to get the feedback. So again, with that in mind, how or from whom will you get feedback when you practice? So let's fill that in for number 4. So for example, if you're practicing in your stretch zone and you make an error, how are you going to know that you made an error? Or how are you going to know what you need to improve and how to improve it? So how or from whom will you get that feedback? Okay. Is anyone struggling here trying to identify the source of feedback? See, Jennifer, what did you choose for yourself as your source of feedback?
A colleague that can program already. So he's
Perfect.
able to read the code and help me when I struggle with the logic and so on.
Perfect. Excellent. Yeah, great source. Okay, so we're going to jump back into breakout rooms. We'll try to mostly keep it the same. And we're looking at the flywheel, focus, stretch, feedback. All of these elements are really, really important. With that, I would love to thank you. Please do follow us on social media. We post a lot of videos, for example, on our YouTube channel. We had a panel discussion recently on how to lead your people through crises. When we talked about leading through traumatic events with business leaders impacted by the ongoing war in Ukraine. We post a lot of other content as well. Definitely check us out at these other links. And we'll hope to see you at a future home class or somewhere else out in this world. Thank you so much. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes. Happy to answer any specific questions. You can also reach out to me at alex@honehq.com. And if you want to continue filling out that form, there are some additional questions that get at some kind of other learning accelerators that could probably help you, like creating social pressure, carving out time to learn, and so forth.